thank you so much for everyone that's here so far. Thank you. Okay, I guess we can start. All right. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have to restart my greeting again for our audience online. Thank you to everyone that's made it here this evening. We were praying that there wasn't going to be rain. And I think the heavens have blessed us. And we are in for an amazing evening tonight. We've got a great panel. The question that we're asking is democracy failing South Africans? South Africa has celebrated 30 years of democracy. And even though we've celebrated 30 years of democracy, our system is under pressure, it's under duress. So much has happened. There's a lot of people who continue to question the legitimacy of democracy in South Africa. There's a lot of people who didn't come out and vote this year as well. So the very legitimacy and the integrity of our democracy is under question. But on the other hand, we've just come out of a watershed election, and we've just created something called the Government of National Unity, the second version. So it's not all doom and gloom. South Africa is a country of amazing contradictions. And I think as we explore this question, those contradictions are going to be fleshed out. We've got an amazing panel tonight. I will just introduce them very quickly. We've got Mr. Moeletsi Mbeki, Chairperson of the South African Institute of International Affairs. We've got Mr. Mmusi Maimane, leader of Build One South Africa. We have Ms. Mbali Ntuli, founder and CEO of Groundwork Collective, and will be moderated by Ms. Ferial Haffajee, who's associate editor at the Daily Maverick. So without further ado, I'd like to also welcome Mr. Rainer Semmet, who is a member of the German Bundestag, to come and do the welcome this evening. Thank you for everyone that's here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final session of Friedrich Naumann's Foundation's Freedom Dialogue Series 2024. Today we are tackling a big question: is democracy failing South Africans? I'm honored to be here with some of the sharpest minds on this subject. It is, our panelists are today Mbali Ntuli, founder and CEO of Groundwork Collective, Moeletsi Mbeki, chairperson of the South African Institute of International Affairs, and Mmusi Maimane, leader of Build One South America. Oh. They also have to change a lot in South America, so maybe they look at you. Our moderator is Ferial Haffajee, associate editor at the Daily Maverick. With their expertise, I'm sure we're in a lively and thoughtful discussion. As someone from Germany, I remember the excitement when South Africa's government of national unity began. It marked a fresh start away from a divided past and showed the potential for different voices to come together. But there are real challenges ahead: high crime, unemployment, poverty, and inequality. These issues are tough and will need strong institutions to solve them. South Africa is not alone. Around the world, democracies are facing struggles. Values like accountability, transparency, and fairness are at risk. These values are crucial because they help build stable society. By holding on to these principles, South Africa can rebuild trust and work together for a fairer society. Despite all challenges, I'm struck by the resilience of South Africans. They've shown time and again they can come together during these tough times. This unity is essential for the future of democracy here. As we start today's dialogue, I hope everyone feels free to share their thoughts openly. I look forward to lively here feeling inspired by the determination of South Africans to keep democracy strong and healthy. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a meaningful discussion this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Simmet. Before we start, we would like to just play a video. And the purpose of this video is a very short video, but it's just to contextualize the conversation and to embed it in the feelings that the ordinary South Africans are feeling. So we didn't just make this question up. It's a narrative that we've observed, that we've picked up. And so this video will just give you a sense of what is happening, what our South Africans are feeling, but also what our panelists have been saying in regards to this question. Thank you.
2024 is our 1994. Let's rescue SA. Build one South Africa. Only action can fix SA. Economic freedom in our lifetime. Together we can do more. Let's do more together. Mbali Ntuli. Pa, pa, pa. Shoot to kill. Shoot the bull. Amandla. We all know these songs and slogans and who they belong to. We know exactly what our political leaders in South Africa think and the direction in which they want South Africa to go. What is alarmingly missing in the conversation in our country is what the citizens have to say.
It's almost 10 away from 7, the Friday edition of the South African Morning. Good to have you with us. I'm Gareth Edwards. Now, listen to the statement. South Africans are not happy with the state of democracy.
We didn't know what democracy is holding for us, like now. There's more poverty than ever before.
Yes, got democracy, but I'm still poor.
Democracy has lost its meaning.
After 30 years, there's still poor people, they got nothing.
Moeletsi Mbeki says South Africa's problem is not money. The country's problem is a crisis of governance.
The governance crisis of the ANC government is the exclusion of large numbers of the population from economic activity.
What is the agenda of the people of South Africa? Now, there are a couple of things that we can take lead from. The first is the Constitution and the institutions that come from the Constitution and the objectives that are ascribed in that Constitution. So the ideals of saying you'll provide housing, you'll provide a job, you'll make sure that there's economic prosperity, that must be the framing issue.
It's a question for you, perhaps. Are you happy with the state of our democracy?
And I'm not talking about complaining every now and then about Eskom on Twitter. I mean, the real civic engagements are the solidarity that we should be having together about what we want to see happening in this country.
And with that, we are ready to start the third and final installment of the Freedom Dialogue series for 2024. Let's put our hands together for our panelists.
Good evening, everybody. So lovely to be with you to discuss a very pertinent topic as your final dialogue for the year. I'd like to get your views first. So let me see by show of hands, who agrees with me? Of course, democracy isn't failing South Africa. We've just had our, 7th election. We've had about 6 presidents. I watched the ANC accept its loss with some dignity and hand over power when many thought it wouldn't. And so who agrees with me on that one? Of course you're not failing, yeah? Here's the other view. Democracy is failing miserably. Today, I listened to the Gauteng Quality of Life survey coming out. And in Gauteng, which is the breadbasket, the wealthiest province in the country, 70% of people said that they felt hopeless. They couldn't find a job. 50% of the people here are on some form of social grant. Another 37% have applied for the 350 Rand social relief of distress grant. So obviously it's failing, because Amartya said that development is freedom. So no, it's failing. Who agrees with that thought? We'll see. Let's hand it to our panel, and we'll start with Moeletsi Mbeki, who always, I suppose, puts us in the picture in such wonderful ways. Welcome.
So,
I'd like you to answer the question, is democracy failing South Africa?
Okay, thank you. Well, you know, when I was given this topic, I was thinking, what actually did we fight for? I don't once remember thinking we were fighting for democracy. I thought we were fighting for liberation against the apartheid regime. I never saw our struggle as being a struggle for democracy. It was for liberation. And of course, coming from the ANC, we had a program called the Freedom Charter. And that was it. That's what we were struggling for. So I was thinking about this topic, that Mbali is more of an expert because she's an educator. So I was thinking she's not doing a very good job educating the people that the struggle was not about democracy. The struggle was about liberation. That's point number one. Point number two, you point out that the people feel that their economic well-being is not advancing. Well, that's not, strictly speaking, to do with democracy. It's to do with the performance of the economy on one side, which the private sector has a lot to do with that, but it is also to do with the policies of the ANC government, not of democracy per se. It's the performance of the ANC government. I have been saying to the ANC government for many years that their policy, for example, of black economic empowerment is a bad policy. It's a bad policy because it disincentivizes black professionals from becoming entrepreneurs. That's what I have been saying to. Now, if you're going to develop a capitalist economy, and this is one of the things that gets forgotten, Mandela was very emphatic. The ANC is not a socialist organization. It is not fighting for socialism. It is fighting for black people in South Africa to have the same opportunity to become capitalists that the whites had. That is what the struggle was about. And he explained many times, but many people seem to have forgotten it, especially the Communist Party. Mandela, at the Rivonia trial, repeated this message, the message that our vision, or his vision of South Africa and the ANC's vision, was of a capitalist economy, but without obstacles for black people to participate and to become entrepreneurs. That's what the struggle was about. So democracy in South Africa, I don't see the constitution being an obstacle to our economic development. I think the priority of most South Africans is the welfare of themselves today and of their children. That is the priority of most South Africans. It's actually not democracy. It's the well-being of their families, and the safety of their families and the safety of the country. That is the priority. If that's what democracy is, great, we'll have that. If it's something else, we'll have that as well. If it gives us something else, we'll have that as well. Thank you, Ferial.
Thank you, Moeletsi. I had always thought democracy is liberation, that it had to be, but interesting answer there. Mbali Ntuli, you're next.
Thank you, Ferial. So let me say that obviously nobody's going to disagree that legislatively our democracy has made enormous improvements to what we had in this country before. People have electricity, access to healthcare, education, many things that were part of the democratic promise that was made that has now, whether we agree that it's been done enough of, but is actually happening. So that's the first thing. In that sense, I think we can all acknowledge that democracy has not failed us in that way, and that even the ANC, of a party that I was not a part of, has done what it could at that particular time. So that's the first thing. But I want to also ask whether or not we are failing democracy, because democracy is not something that is stagnant. It's not something that becomes an inevitable goal without us progressively making it part of it. And I think that as citizens in particular, after 1994, we really let democracy become something that was in the hands of political parties, political players, and most importantly, the IEC. And so once in every 5 years, we go to vote, or we go and do our local municipality votes, and we think that we've done our democratic duties. We don't do anything in between those 5 years to actually make sure that our democracy works. And that means that we have a distorted version of what democracy was. And that's not something that is not typical of Africa, because 30 years into democracy, most African countries, as we've seen in the continent, either become more democratic or less democratic, and nobody has the muscle memory to do anything else, because that is I suppose, the overture of what colonialism has done. We are in a very different situation in South Africa, where we have had, at least now, another democratic election where it was peaceful, power has been given to various parties, and psychologically it's broken the mold that only one party can actually be in power. And yet still we are having these conversations about whether the GNU is like something that's good or not, and we're not discussing whether or not the GNU is here. What do we do as citizens to enforce any political party or any politician that is in power to do what we want them to do? And I think that that's where we have misunderstood what democracy is really about. It's not about whether you can have elections or whether they can be peaceful. It's about what you do in between, and whether your citizens are literate enough, whether it is in terms of civics or whatever else, to be able to hold the state accountable and make them do the will of the people, because that is what democracy is. I do want to just reply to a few things around what Moeletsi had said, particularly that democracy was the advent of, some kind of democratic reform. I think the Freedom Charter was a little bit more than that. There was land, there was metrics around success, around non-racialism, allowed education. There was a lot of things that were spoken about there that I think, particularly the older generation in South Africa, have now decided that they are incubated towards, and so don't really fight anymore. And it's left to us as younger people in particular to take on that struggle, and perhaps this is the natural flow of order, to pursue it, because again, as I say, democracy is not a one-stop event. It has to be something that continues all the time. And I don't see that in every single aspect, particularly for a disadvantaged person, umuntu who's part of abahlali basemjondolo feels that democracy means anything to them. It becomes an abstract thought when people are still living in poverty, when people are still having to fight for water, land, any kind of thing. And so democracy becomes an abstract thing that they don't really feel means very much, aside from the fact that they have the substantial freedom of being able to vote. But as I say, if you don't vote, or if you do vote, but it doesn't make much of a difference, or doesn't have any carry-on, it doesn't actually really mean anything. And so our democracy has become quite abstract, and we need to find a way as a society to make it something that is very personal for people, in a way that they see that they can actually be a difference. And we have an electoral reform committee that is happening right now that ends on the 30th of October that has very little public participation. And what that means is that the elites in particular, whether it's political, business, or anything, are going to be the one that decides how our electoral reform takes place and what happens in the next elections. And I think that what we've missed particularly is that we haven't brought everyone towards what the democratic projects could really be. And so democracy in itself is not failing. We've had a very peaceful election and a turnover of power that's been interesting and great if you believe in the GNU or not, and whatever. But does it mean anything substantially to ugogo osemkhanyangute who lives on a 350 grant, or the 90 million people that apply for that 350 grant and only 8 million of them are given? I don't think that they see democracy in the same way now. And I think that we radically need to reimagine what it means for everyone and how they can access it and make real power of it. Because if you can't actually utilize the democracy that you have, does it really mean anything? And does it mean that you really have democracy?
Thank you very much, Mbali. Mmusi, welcome.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. I happen to be going tomorrow to make submissions to the very famous Electoral Amendment Committee that has been established. But I think the question is a good one in that, is democracy failing? The contrary question is, compared to what? Right? Something is good or bad compared to something else in this particular instance. So if we were to make alternative choices, I'll take one very obvious. If we didn't have democratic practice, what would we have in this country? And then ask ourselves the question, would whatever that alternative that you imagine be able to deliver developmental goals, governance goals, and certainly economic objectives that we are busy grappling with? I would posit to say no. Because for as many Singaporean stories of Lee Kuan Yew that you talk about, there are sufficient other examples of benign, so people are often fantasizing about benign dictators who have delivered quite the contrary. So I think we must think about the question relative to what else is on the table. The second point I think is important to make is to say South Africa finds itself in a fairly interesting space. I think to some extent I'm a little bit more patient given the fact that of the SADC countries, South Africa is about the last to be democratized. Which means we're busy learning all of these exercises of transfer of power, etc., transitions, etc. But we've been served okay in certain instances. If you think about it, Johannesburg, sometimes we think of democracy only at national level. Let's think about it at municipalities that have changed. We've seen a transfer of power, we've seen changes.
6 times in 3 years.
Maybe far too often than what we'd like. But no one has died in the process, and no one has been stopped from starting an opposition party or has their views suppressed. Eh? Except in KZN, okay. So I do think we need to accept the fact that even as much as I think sometimes democracy can be expropriated by the elite without compensation, that I do think sometimes poor South Africans are quite quick to exercise the choice as to who they want as their ward councillor in voting, and exercise that choice, right? You might argue it's still all party political, but frankly, I have more hope and optimism in the fact that I've seen people exercise that choice. With all of that in mind, I think, though, we can synonymize democracy and ask, can you build democracy without Democrats, which I think SADC has suffered from? The second thing is, can you sustain democracy without decent leadership? And I would argue you can't. And I think that is our dilemma. We have a leadership crisis as a country. And because of that, it leads to the second almost corollary, which is an economic crisis, naturally. Because as things sit at the moment, just for ease of numbers, I think sometimes we don't as a country have a decent conversation about poverty. But if you were to ask the question, what does it take for a South African to survive daily? That number, I spoke to the statistician general the other day, is 60 rand per day. 18 million South Africans in this country are living on less than 35 rands a day. So if you were to speak to those South Africans, to Mbali's point and to Moeletsi's point, they would tell you quite categorically, democracy for who? We don't eat the constitution. We're hungry here, which is a fair point. So we have to be able to say, how do we engage those particular citizens in an economic crisis that they face? We also, along with that, have to wonder when institutional capture occurs emanating from the constitution. Because there's some leadership failures equally so. When you take an institution like the public protector and you kind of run a relay baton of institutional weaknesses where leadership is the ultimate dividend that matters, when you've got poor leaders, those institutions also become eroded progressively. So my view, if I was to make a submission tonight, would be to say, has democracy failed South Africa? I think leadership and economic questions have failed South Africa. What do we do going in the next 30 years? I think we need to reform the way we vote. I think that will help strengthen the leadership question in some ways, and maybe to a point about electoral reform. And then I certainly do think that we need to think hard about our economic prospects, because when people say democracy has been captured by populists, etc., they point to the wrong metric when they say populists. They forget the fact that even questions of immigration can be questions of the economy. Even questions of spatial allocation are questions of the economy. So I really do think we need to answer, perhaps over the next 30, what is our economic prospects? And maybe that touches a little bit about what Moeletsi is saying about the Freedom Charter. I think if we don't attend to the economic question, what naturally will happen is an opting out of voting for leaders. But that doesn't mean South Africans are not Democrats.
Thank you very much. Important points. Moeletsi, so whenever, I don't know if you remember, the late great Tito Mboweni used to often remark about how much he loved Rwanda. And people would get so angry with him because it's not a democracy. But I'm not sure if you've had the same experience on visiting Kigali or Rwanda and seeing where that country has grown to versus our country, which won its freedom in '94 as the Rwandans were facing an appalling genocide. The trajectories have been so different. And it's not a facile a binary, with one doesn't have democracy and the other does, and therefore we need a Lee Kuan Yew type Singapore model here. But why is it that South Africans look at Rwanda and go, why can't we have that here? What's the difference?
Well, the Rwandan regime of Kagame has tried to kill opposition leaders who are in exile in South Africa. And they succeeded in one case. They killed him in Sandton in a hotel room. They shot at another one who they tried several times to, but he survived. So in South Africa, I think South Africans respect opposition leaders. And they want opposition leaders to do their job and criticize what government is doing wrong, and not to be threatened by the state and by the ruling party for opposing. So that's one point about Rwanda. So Rwanda kills opposition leaders, and that is definitely won't get the support of South Africans, and certainly doesn't have my support. Secondly, Rwanda is pillaging the natural resources of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The United Nations has done studies about the looting of the mineral resources of the Congo, of the Democratic Republic of Congo, by Uganda and by Rwanda. And there are, of course, others as well.
But it's still very nice when you visit. I mean, the governance is quite something, right? It's so clean and it's working.
I wouldn't say that. I would far rather be a poor South African with my democracy and my opposition leaders articulating my sentiments and my point of view than a rich Rwandan who can't say anything about the state of their country.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to that. So Mbali, when last I saw you, I was so excited at your plans to get young people to vote. They would come out in numbers. You were incentivizing them in the cleverest ways that I've seen. Come voting day, though, they didn't come out. And I think, what is the number? 24 million South Africans who could vote didn't. And that tells you something, and I'm wondering, what's the message in that? And why didn't young people, despite significant resources going into programs and campaigns, why did they turn away that way?
Well, it wasn't young people. In fact, we registered the highest number of young voters, which was over 80,000, which is more than some political parties got who are represented in parliament. So it definitely wasn't young people that didn't come out. And I will say that also, I think political parties in the sixth administration spited their noses, what is the term? Their faces and their noses, whatever, you know what I mean. The point was, when they did the Section 24A, we had 300,000 people that then spoiled their ballots, and over 1 million that actually ended up not being able to necessarily vote. And I think that that was a significant part of what happened in this election, which is why things like electoral reform and public participation are so important, because we allowed political parties to have the lion's share of what happened in this last election, including determining what individuals could do, or independents could do, or new parties could do, making them, have more signatures that they needed to acquire than ever before. And this is why in the next iteration it's so important. But young people are the ones that came out to vote. Actually, 82% of them did. And so we showed up, even if our vote was insignificant overall, but in terms of our own population, was incredible. And I think that that means that we actually have a lot of work to do, again, on civic participation, and we need to do it across the board, which is why we are also doing now work in high schools and junior schools, because it has to become a behavior change in South Africa. The majority of South Africans, most of you don't even know how your state works. How many of you actually go to your IDP meetings? How many of you have ever met your counselor? You might have them on WhatsApp and you're so excited because you think that that's great democracy, but that bar is so low. That just means that somebody got your number or some database and they are able to talk to you. But in real terms, very few of us, unless you really make the effort, ever really interact with our state in a way that you feel you can hold them accountable. Whether it's an SGB if you have kids in public schools, or a CPF if you know that your community might not be safe. And that is why I say democracy is not failing. We are failing democracy because we don't participate. And we become entitled to understand and believe that other people must do the work. Civil society, NGOs, everyone else, except us, because we're so busy and we have our jobs and 9-to-5s and we're trying to build the economy. The economy will fail if you don't do all of these other things too. And I'm not saying that you must, write to Mmusi to change the scheme of what Eskom is doing. But the little things that we should be doing are the little things that build up into making sure that we have accountable people that understand that they work for us, not the other way around. And until we understand that democracy doesn't work because you have these bright people in office who make great economic plans. Democracies, and the best ones, and I'm glad that the Friedrich Naumann Foundation is funding this, the best democracies happen because citizens themselves decide that this is what we want to do. And they are a great example of what happened after World War II. And as South Africa, we have not come to that point. And I feel like we continue to have these dialogues where we feel like if enough of us just feel really great about guys, we should do this, but don't actually do it, we're not going to get there. So we need to organize, and I'm not saying that it needs to be a big organization. It could be your street, your UIP, your library. Get your child and you to actually get a library card, because that gives money and more revenue to the actual library that's there and continues to keep it open. Those are the small practical steps that we can take to actually make sure that as citizens we have a real say. And until we do that, you can't blame the youth for anything. Because me, as a young person, is tired of this constant dialogue and the patience that the older generation wants. And what's going to happen is that no walls are going to be high enough when we are fed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I get, yep, please. Yeah. And I want to endorse that view because, I mean, I can give you in practical sense, you know, all of us here, the budget will affect your life one way or another. I can speak about that because I spend my days looking at that issue. The executive makes one proposal regarding what the budget is, whether it's appropriations, divisions of revenue, whatever the case might be. It'll be tabled on Wednesday. A week straight after that, or 2 weeks, the public are invited to make submissions. I can tell you as night follows day, how many of you will be at those meetings? It's a fact of life. So we got to go out to communities and invite them. You got to make your submissions because the budget is just but a piece of legislation. It's a law. It's a proposal. And for me, I think it speaks inherently to how, as the Constitutional Court found that Parliament had failed to do its job when it came to state capture. I think that is just but one slither of indictment against Parliament. In truth, Parliament does not invite citizens, and that is the apex of where the South African voice sits. And the problem with it is that it is comforting for me as a member of Parliament to just spew out nonsense to citizens because they don't have to hold me accountable on that basis, and I don't have to answer their call. And therein lies the failure. It's not democracy. It's the fact that people then arrive in Parliament and can literally spend 5 years ignoring the citizen and get away with it.
Can they still do that, though? Because what I saw in May was a massive snot clap by the people who did go out and vote. The result was unexpected. I mean, I watched the ANC, I think you were there, Mbali. They couldn't believe that 40% end result. Even the DA couldn't believe at, I think 21.8 is where they ended up. People voted for smaller parties. Do you think that kind of impunity of not holding your MP accountable will still work? I mean, are you part of the GNU or not? No?
I'm not part of the GNU, precisely because I think you need constructive opposition in this country. It's helpful to hold the system to account. My worry about your synopsis there is that, sure, it was punishing of the ANC. But when you look at the cumulative votes between the ANC, MK, EFF, it still represents near 2/3, which tells you that, one, as an opposition, we haven't done enough to give South Africans an alternative view of the world, so that the choice is actually quite in that sense. And secondly, quite stark, is that South Africans, I think, don't despise democracy. It's just that sometimes I think, even with the change, is anything changing, really? It's 100 days into the GNU. Frankly, I haven't seen a different economic plan.
What's it like at Parliament now?
Parliament,
I mean, is Parliament like this place of ideas and contestation and accountability? You're laughing, Mbali.
The committee work has gotten better simply because now you don't have a lot of one-party dominance in and of itself. That's helpful. And there's been a significant humbling of the ANC, so there's a genuine openness to hearing. The problem is, and this is for me, when I say the democratic choice that you present before citizens, I want to look at maybe the UK, and it's a bad comparison because it's not apples and apples. The democratic practice in the UK has been fairly long. But here's one thing. Liz Truss was recently elected as Prime Minister. She arrives with an economic plan that clearly the Brits don't like. There is a genuine repudiation of that and a swapping over, clearly because they don't like what's happening. In South Africa, one of my big fears is that you could elect someone else, but because there isn't, if you like, the degree of change that you sometimes want to bake into the system, you can end up with different colors, but same processes. And that, for me, is because the capacitation of political parties, political leaders, is often so bad that they arrive in office ill prepared for what you can't cost what the MK's economic plan will bring to this country. You can't cost what the FF's, DA's, whatever. You can't. And the worst indictment is this. When you look at the tools that we use to assess whether inputs by the state from today to the next 5 years, what is the world going to look like? One, it's difficult when you ask me how Parliament is doing. It's difficult for anyone to make any sensible inputs because political parties come with slogans rather than an actual plan. And then secondly, that when you look at it 5 years on, there isn't a sense of accountability. All we can talk about is, well, GDP growth has been 1%, we've seen a decline in this, but we don't hold politicians accountable for that. We only hold them to be accountable for corruption. If we're going to strengthen democracy, we need to look at other indicators, and that speaks to both, not only you as citizens and all of us, but it also speaks to what our media framework is, our legal framework is, so that we begin to highlight the fact that if there are 100 kids who start school and 40 don't get there, someone must be accountable.
Somebody must be held accountable. Yeah. That's right. Please, Moeletsi, you want to say something?
Well, I want to challenge Mmusi. One of the problems we have and I think it's a very big problem, is the variety in our opposition parties, the different messages that are coming out of our opposition parties. I think the South African voter is being given a lot of political parties, but many of them are saying more or less the same thing. So I think our political class, if there is such a thing, also has to answer. Where is it diverted? If I look at the European political parties, there's lots of diversity. There may be 4 or 5 European parties. There are social democratic parties which have close links with the trade unions, with the students' unions, and so on. We don't have such parties in South Africa. Everybody
we have the EFF,
well,
close to the students.
Okay,
but that's the ANC in drag.
Yes.
So let's just, it's all the ANC.
The EFF people objecting here.
So I think this
Maybe
is,
not.
for me, this is one of our challenges, is we need more diversity in our opposition
Can I ask you, I'm coming, Mbali, I just want to ask you a quick follow. Didn't MK completely shatter that view? It's something new. How do you understand MK?
Well, my understanding of MK is that MK are the ANC voters who were normally not voting. And then when Jacob Zuma came up with his, so they said, okay, this time we will go and vote. Because we all knew that the ANC was not going to win the election long before there was an MK party. We knew the ANC was going to lose the election during the November 2021 local government election, because the national component of the local government election showed that the ANC was not going to make 50%. So the MK party is not bringing anything new. It is going to the ANC voters who got disillusioned and decided not to vote. But that's not new.
So it's just a splinter.
Yeah.
Please, Mbali, thank you, Moeletsi. Mbali, you're going to say?
Thanks. So I want to just reply to 2 things and then make comments. The first is around Mmusi's comments about distrust, which I think he's right about, in terms of there being some measure of how one does in the UK. What I think is missing from South Africa in this particular aspect is that we don't have a recall function. We have no way, unless your councillor dies or was assassinated. I'm from KZN, so this is a big part of what I live through. You have no way, truly, of getting parties who have a closed system to recall councillors at the very least, and MPs more so, to account. And so, yes, there's legislation. You can write to the speaker, you can do a whole bunch of stuff. But typically, in the real fashion, it's a closed system, so you don't actually have a way. And this is why I'm going to sound like a broken record tonight. We have the option as South Africans until the 30th of October to write that this is bullshit and that we don't want that to be the case anymore, like we see in other countries. We need to have a form where it's a multi-party or a multi-member constituency system. There's many different forms that we could decide that we want to take, but they all include embedded in them a way for us as citizens to say, this councillor or this MP doesn't work for us, and this is what we want to do. And if we're not going to do that, we're going to continue to have the same system. So I want to make that as a point to what Mmusi was saying, is that we need ourselves. Politicians are not going to do it. It's not in their interest, but we can do it. And there's a whole forum that is open for us to do it. So that's the first. And then I just wanted to say, the other thing around the MK that you were asking about is, I think that the MK was a very interesting anomaly, not so much for those of us in KZN who had seen it kind of really infiltrating the ANC branches and other places. And what I think is very interesting about this is that it shows actually how tenuous the relationship is between South Africans and what they feel democracy is. KZN is the best example of any province, and you can go back in history, that actually allows political parties. People think it's a homogenous political society because it's predominantly Zulu, but actually you have the MF, the NFP, Sedesmo. Anyone that wants to start a party should definitely go to KZN to see whether it's going to work, because they will give you some kind of votes. And I think that MK was able to exploit that and was able to do really well, not because of their great aptitude, but because people were so angry at the ANC. And our anger doesn't just come out in votes, it comes out in the 4,500 protests that we have as a year, which is a legitimate form of real political protest about what we are trying to say as a society. Just that those people might not have the social capital to write to parliament or to be in these spaces, but that is how they protest. And so I don't think that the MK and what came about it was an anomaly. People in this country are begging us to change the system. People in this country are asking us to do better than we are actually doing. And not just at a political level, at a civil society level, at a social level, and even civil society is not organized as much as it should be. And I think that the GNU and what we have now presents, whether you believe in it or not, just a very small opportunity for us to quickly coalesce and decide what could we do to exploit what is happening while everyone is in a system of flux and a system of chaos. If we are really brave and imaginative, what could we achieve as a country? The same as we did in the 80s when we had the UDF and we weren't sure if democracy was going to go the ways or not. I think that this is where we are now, and I think that we are intellectualizing it too much as opposed to actually taking real action.
To use the moment, be it to push for wealth tax, basic income, in any of the big policies.
UBI, whatever.
May we open to questions and comments from the floor now before we come back for another round? I do want to push into the future and just see how 2026 is beginning to shape. Any questions? Yes, sir. Is there a mic maybe, or shall I? Let's see.
Good evening, colleagues. A quick statement and then the question.
What's your name?
My name is Andre Young. I run a business called Business Transformation Design, and I'm particularly curious about transformation. Born in the 60s, so I was one of those first youngsters in '94 to vote. And when I read the Freedom Charter as a youngster, it inspired me because it offered a promise of prosperity for us as South Africans that we failed with this democratic fallacy. We failed to deliver on prosperity. I measure prosperity with housing, with education, with access to clean land and water, and just the basics, let alone and economics. So here's my question. Has democracy delivered the dignity of a South African? Does it even today support the dignity of a South African? And should we be assessing this divided past, this divided head, heart, and hands in every South African before we even allow any of them to take the responsibility of the delivery of freedom to our people.
Thank you very much. Can I get a second question? Khaleb?
Thank you. Very interesting. I have a couple of comments and questions. One is, in terms of comments, capitalism is clearly an engine, democracy clearly a system, and taxation a mechanism. Now, all of the above may allow you, within various frameworks, whether they be neoliberal, centrist, socialist, or whatever, to fire the engine within a system to deliver in a country which has the highest Gini coefficient in the whole bloody world. For that to happen, you need adherence to a framework. That's not based on theft, adherence to a framework, Mmusi. That's not based on theft and elite formation. And now, is this possible? Or are we en route to replicate many of the other Sub-Saharan examples which exist and who had a head start on us and got nowhere faster, apart from a couple like Mauritius and Botswana, which are excluded perhaps, and even the ones that are highlighted, like Rwanda, are fraught with massive problems in terms of authoritarianism and human rights and what's hidden behind the scenes. Then the other attendant questions are, can you mobilize the youth? Is this possible, and under what circumstances? Because they've been utterly absent from any interest in what the hell's going on in our country, to their own detriment and to everyone's detriment around here. And that needs to be addressed, and nobody has particularly broken that. Some have tried and they failed miserably. Can we break the stranglehold that the traditional authorities have on the rural vote, which delivers us to a powerless place in terms of democracy, because we have an urban democracy and a rural autocracy? Those are questions which need to be addressed. And then, you know, can the lumpen proletariat be mobilized in a progressive way rather than in a populist way, which will then open the door in a populist way to all sorts of horrors going forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khaleb. Great questions. So there's a lot there. Let's start with the question of, do we frame dignity enough and dignity as freedom and democracy sufficiently? And how can we do better? Moeletsi, do you want to have a go at dignity?
Dignity. Wow. Well, you know, in 1994, I think we reclaimed, the black people in South Africa reclaimed our dignity.
I think the gentleman is saying we didn't. Yeah.
Oh, okay, well, I dispute that. I think we reclaimed our dignity. We had been at war since, I think, the first war between the Africans in South Africa and Europeans was in 1510. This was a clash between the Khoisan people and the Portuguese who were trying to steal their livestock. So if you go from 1510 up to 1994, the people of South Africa had fought a huge war and they succeeded because they got what they wanted, which was their own government. So I don't think we failed. We succeeded. It took us 400 years, but we succeeded, and we got our own government. Now, has the government that we got done what we thought it should do? Initially, yes, it did. It did initially do quite a lot of what we thought it should do. But as happens with all single-party dominance situations. Then they decide that the voters don't count anymore because they take the voters for granted. They say the voters will always vote for me. And they started looking after themselves instead of looking after the people and instead of looking after the voters. So what has happened, what happened in May 2029, the voters told them no. And because the voters still have their dignity, they said, no, we will not vote for you. So I think myself, the people of South Africa, the ANC is on its way out.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, the ANC is on its way out because of what Caleb was saying. It's a party of the elite that is looking after the interests of the elite, but it wants the vote of the mass of the people of South Africa. The mass of the people of South Africa are saying no. Now, how do you do the transition from a dominant party and you have new parties emerge and so on? I think we thought it was simpler than what it is. It's actually much more complex. That's the other message that the May election told us, is that moving from a single dominant party, if you don't have real social upheaval, which we don't have in South Africa, and replacing it with new parties is a much more complex process than we thought.
Thank you. Do you want to answer some of Khaleb's questions?
I think each of them deserve a whole seminar on their own.
They do.
But I think maybe let me, what I certainly think is starting to emerge is that there is a reimagining of coalitions that are taking place. And why I start there is because you may not agree with the Progressive Caucus and the bastardization of that term, because in many ways it's a term almost to denote the idea that those parties exist for the advancement of the black Africans.
Don't you just want to just remind people what the Progressive Caucus is?
So the Progressive Caucus is constituted between the EFF and MK and a number of other parties, PAC, there are a few of them, who have all coalesced around this idea that they are the new black liberators. When I look at some of their leaders, some of their governance records indicate there were profound hindrances to some of the development of black South Africans as a function of corruption. So when I talk about the bastardization of the term, I think that's where it kind of sits. There is another school of thought that puts the GNU kind of parties somewhere in there. And then I think there's a reconfiguration of what would be a democratic centrist caucus. I think all of those processes are healthy for South Africa. I really do. I think that what is going to happen over a period of time is that, one, we might have maybe by accident broken the hegemonic view that the ANC will govern until Jesus comes back. That's an important marker. The second most important marker is that our politics can only be denoted on the basis of racial divisions. And I actually do think that a combination of the ANC and the DA does help that conversation a little bit, which are all healthy things, because at the end of the day, projecting towards elections forward, which are some of Khaleb's questions, which are plenty that's in their nature, I think there can be an emergence of a new agenda that can be championed by a few number of parties who can coalesce around that and give voters that option. Underpinning that is that we do, and I don't want to beat the same drum as there has been beat before, unless we amend the Electoral Act, pre-coalitions become hard. Because post-coalitions are some of the dilemma we face now. What we have to do is, when we amend the Electoral Act, it's not just multiple constituencies, etc. Part of it is being able to say, hey, Party X, you might have a strong representation in KZN. We're going to sit back, let you contest there, because our ideals are similar. And I think that, for me, holds the key to hope that the next 5 years looks like. And then if you wouldn't mind, I do think the question of dignity, I don't think is impugned by democracy. I really do not. I think...
Even if you're hungry.
I think poverty, and I made a big note here, poverty in this country undermines dignity. And by poverty, it must be multi-dimensional poverty. Not just food insecurity, but educational insecurity, poor access to healthcare, and the fact that you are economically excluded. When you take that multi-dimensional view of poverty, you then arrive at the point where it simply can be that indeed a hungry person for any of those things cannot claim freedom. But the question must be economical, about the economy, not about democracy in that sense.
Thank you. Mbali, I know you don't like taking the youth questions always, but Khaleb had one there.
Thank you, and I think Mmusi's partly covered me on the democracy dignity question, because I also was going to go similarly that route. So Khaleb asked a number of questions, and one of the ones were, can we really mobilize the youth? I would argue that the youth is incredibly mobilized. If you look at the 150,000 civil society organizations that are registered with the DSD, almost 75% of them are youth-led. Those are young people in their communities that are actually trying to do something, whether it's a creche or someone delivering HIV pills, or whatever the case is. It's not a question of whether we can mobilize the youth, it's whether or not we have a framework that allows for this kind of mobilization to become something that becomes public policy and reach Mmusi's table per se. And I think that that can't just be left at the youth particular table. But I mean, if you want examples, of course, we've seen NISFIS and we've seen Feesness Falls that have happened. And I just think that there's an overemphasis on the idea that young people must also participate in democracy in the way that has always been done. So often when I talk on these panels, people want to talk about civil society and the UDF, which is great. But the nature of protest, the nature of the way that we organize has changed. Back in the day, people used to watch news at 7 p.m. You all read the same newspapers. That is not the case. We've got TikTok and social media and all other kinds of ways that young people organize, and it's not going to look the same way. So it might not seem as though they were actually talking and working towards something, but that doesn't mean that young people are disengaged. And in fact, our own research in South Africa shows us that it is completely opposite to what is happening. Whether or not they believe that politics and the political system is the way that they should fully engage is up to question. But it's not that they are staying away. So that's the one thing. And I suppose Mmusi's kind of answered it in the last part of his remarks, is that there has to be different ways in which we agree that we can have these platforms. And I think for young people, particularly in South Africa, we're only 30 years in, and the majority of us are probably only 15 years into being adults, is for us to reimagine how we want to interact with the state and how we want to think about how we change things. And the one, of course, is always protest, there's policy, but again, it becomes about social capital and who do we access to have these conversations? And I think we are figuring that out, but it doesn't mean that we don't care about our country. In fact, I think we care more, which is why I was saying earlier, that if there's ever going to be an impatient generation, it's probably going to be young people. And it might not be rooted in populism, but it will be rooted in some form of action. And the action might not be the action that people want to have seen. But unless we're going to talk about how we can democratize democracy and the access to being able to be people that can have a voice in these conversations, not just here, but everywhere, then that's what we are brewing in our society. And I just also wanted to say, there was a question about why centrists have lost and, who is organized politically. I think that people on the ground are incredibly organized. I think the middle class is not organized. I think the middle class...
What about our WhatsApp groups? We are very well organized.
That's great. Yeah, you guys we go on our WhatsApp groups. But the thing really is what would you be willing to give up to actually be part of where the Frans Fanon calls it, class suicide or whatever it is that we decide to call it. But what are you willing to give up to say that this is what other South Africans should have? Is it going to be your car? Is it going to be a fancy Stanton apartment? What are we prepared as the middle class to really say that we are willing to give up to make sure that other people who are not in the middle class are able to ascend? Is it a universal basic income grant, which is a stagnant conversation in our country, but maybe one of the ways that we get people out of the void that we see with the 9 million people that apply every month but don't get anything? And I think we aren't having those conversations honestly. And I talk about this myself as somebody who's probably in a privileged, very elite amount of South Africans. And until we do, we'll have this, and we'll have this other thing about people protesting and doing things and youth being on the periphery until it's no longer that thing that we can do.
Thank you very much, Mmusi.
I just wanted to make a 30-second input here, which is this, that actually part of what is suppressing democratic participation is that I frankly think we lack ambition as a country. I think we dream of a better yesterday. I think in the main, when we talk, I listen to, when I look at our cabinet with respect, genuinely, I sometimes look at even the age distribution and ask myself the honest question. Would a young person look at that and go, that person is going to articulate for me the dream I want?
I have to differ with you.
Please do.
Siviwe Gwarube, 32 years old. Leon Schreiber, 35 years old.
But now let me ask a question. So
Ronald
Siviwe,
Lamola, 40-something years old.
I am a huge fan of Siviwe. One of my favorite South Africans. Love
Does
Siviwe.
age mean your representation?
I am waiting for Siviwe, and I would say it with her here, to say, Siviwe, rather than tell me how you are going to, in some ways, fix what has happened, tell me what does the education of the future look like. That's what I want to know. I don't want us to be fixing and having a discussion about a better yesterday.
Where are you going to?
That's Mbali for you.
Yeah, I love it.
And it's the same for Ronald. With a mistake we can make is to assume that sometimes inculcating young people into the thing, for them to fight for old ideas, is us introducing diversity.
Very good point. So you want to see what's your fresh idea?
Let's get a better conversation about tomorrow. If we build a school in the township, may it not look like the apartheid infrastructure we've inherited. May it be something better.
Great point there. I want to check if there's questions outside, and I will come to you. Are there any outside? Kaya, would you like to have a question? Okay. I'm not outside. Yeah, it's fine. You can go. Is there a mic? You can use this one.
We have a mic outside. We have a question outside, please.
I'll come now.
All right, thank you. I just have a couple of reflection points. First one, I'm puzzled about the consensus between Mmusi and Mbali that Liz Truss was elected. She was never elected into anything. Liz Truss, she was never elected. But quite interestingly,
but she was a lettuce.
Yeah, she was.
No, Duma, let me clarify the point. Yeah. I didn't mean that she won an election, etc. I merely meant when she arrived armed with an economic suitcase, there was proper modeling and there was repudiation or acceptance thereof. And I'm making the point that political parties in this country don't arrive with models that can be tested one way or another.
Got you.
That is the point I was trying to make.
Okay.
Carry on.
Right. The point that I wanted to raise is that, interestingly, her accession is what I think is the crux of the South African problem. So what I've been saying for years is that part of the problem we have in South Africa is that we've actually never elected a president in our capacity as citizens, because we've got a system that says that you are going to win your internal party structure, and then once you that, then we endorse the party ticket. And that's the same problem that the Conservatives have had in the United Kingdom, in that that entire conveyor belt of Truss and Sunak and all of that was an internal party thing. And as it was happening, it was so alienating to the voters. The first chance they had an ability to then say, we don't like, then they threw out the party at large. And South Africa's ANC problem has always been that none of you could have ever, well, none of us have ever been in a position to say, actually, we do not think that this is the way things need to be. Because the first question would be, are you a member of the ANC to begin with? So in South Africa, the model is broken in the sense that when you look at local government structures, that is where perhaps the proximity is a bit stronger in that I can decide who my councillor is or shouldn't be. But in that particular system, it's perhaps a bit more responsive because of the proximity, but the power doesn't exist there. And then at the bigger system, where there is this insulation from the issues of the day, because you could never remove Jacob Zuma legitimately on the basis that none of us ever actually appointed him as president. We endorsed the ANC, and the ANC decided that he was good enough. So until the ANC had an evolution in its thinking, we had no legitimate reason for saying Zuma must fall, which is why that whole 2016 thing was a bit nonsensical in my view. So we need to be able to revisit the question of whether we want a more responsive system that then says that if the citizens of South Africa say that you're not good enough, then you are not good enough, rather than us being told that, well, until you're a member of the ANC, it's kind of irrelevant what you say. And that's the problem that we have. And we've got the proximity at local government, but the power doesn't exist there. So your councillor would want to fix potholes, but she doesn't have the budget to do so. So the model is a bit broken. The power lies in the wrong place.
Absolutely. We have a question outside. Thank you, Kaya. That's great. I've got a question outside. Anybody outside?
Hello.
Hello.
The name is Rashid. I've got two questions. Firstly is that this election, the 2024 election, only 1 out of 3 people voted. 16 out of a possible 40 million people voted. So I just want to ask the panel, in terms of forcing people to vote, in other countries it's a crime if you don't vote, and there should be automatic registration where people don't have to go out and register. And that was one of the problems why there was such a low voter turnout this time. So just an opinion from the panelists. And then Moeletsi Mbeki, my hero and mentor, you wrote the book in 2008, Architects of Poverty. You visited my place, and you have the answer to this country. It is to reindustrialize. Do you feel that the current government can do something about that and to cure this pandemic of unemployment, inequality? You have the answer, but no one seems to be listening to you. How do you feel about that?
Thank you, Rashid. Any other questions outside? Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Just a quick one. It's a bit of a comment. So there's an opportunity that the GNU, I don't really want to give my name because my organization doesn't really allow me to be political. So I just want to make the comment that there's an opportunity that the GNU creates for us, right? But there's also the detraction that it also creates in that the opposition is silent. The opposition is co-opted, and the opposition has become a PR campaign. So we've seen with the GNU, there's a lot of opposition players that are online, on social media, showing all the great work that they're doing, whether it's true or not. And the question is, are we using social media effectively? We keep talking about the fact that the youth is not being engaged and the youth is not showing up, but are we using the mechanisms that the youth uses to engage each other? And then secondly, what is the danger of what's happening with some of the opposition players playing up the PR online around some of the things that they are doing that were already in the pipeline to begin with?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Ma'am, quick one from you, please.
Hello. Yeah, I'm a retired diplomat from the Bolivian consulate, honorary consul of Bolivia. And I'd just like to perhaps give you a slight comparison with what Bolivia went through. I hear the word dignity. In Bolivia, presently, we have a bonus, which is a grant that is called dignity. And that is basically providing enough money for the very, very poor people to survive. And I think South Africa should also take an example that this dignity bonus, it doesn't come from the government. And you must not feel as a South African government that you are giving a grant, you are giving charity. You are basically sharing the resources of a country. In that case of Bolivia, we were sharing the resources and the income that we produce because we are a very rich country in resources like South Africa. We have gas, we've got oil, we've got minerals, And so instead of having Australian companies, UK companies, Canadian companies taking that money out of the country, we nationalize those companies, and then we manage those resources, and we then splitted those resources among the citizens of the country. Thank you.
Very popular, your message there. Thank you so much. You had a quick one here? Yeah, you can have this.
Thank you very much. I'm Kaija Doreen from Uganda, and I'm from the NUP party in Uganda. Very much humbled to be part of this platform. One, and a quick one, is we, in the context of our country in Uganda, we may be viewing South Africa as the only green tea or green tree in the desert. Let's take the context of the African continent in regard to democracy. And I want to state that there is no alternative to democracy anywhere. There is no reference in history that serves us that countries have failed because of democracy. But we've seen countries that have failed because of the authoritarian rule. We've seen countries that have failed because of the authoritarian rule. I would beg in this room that not anyone maybe think or even dream of having an alternative to democracy, because there can never be one of it. And it is one of the hardest times that any nation can go through, because democracy, we believe, is a process to which every country goes. We keep growing. But in some nations, or the most nations of Africa today, we keep filing and keep pushing to have at least a resemblance of democracy. Thank you.
Okay, so shall we wrap our final comments and answers? Moeletsi, should voting be made mandatory? That was a question from outside. And any final comments you have? Huh?
Yeah, okay, no, I don't think voting. Australia, if I remember correctly, has a mandatory voting legislation. But I think we in South Africa voted to be able to make, we fought to be able to make choices. So I think this would be resisted by the population, the notion of being compelled to have to participate. Secondly, the issue of our electoral law, it really is a serious problem. The electoral law has to be amended to introduce constituencies. Because I belonged to the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, and the constituency that I was associated with was the Labour Party could never win in that constituency. It was a safe Conservative Party constituency. But still, the members of the Labour Party went out to campaign for their member of parliament, even though we knew he was going to lose, but he was still our member of parliament. And what we chose him, and he stood for us. So I think this is a critical question, the question of introducing constituencies in South Africa. It's not to say we should do away with the PR system. Countries like Germany have a combination of both. So we can look at how what we can learn from them.
Thank you. Sorry.
Can I, the issue that was raised by that, unfortunately we don't have time. Mbali raised the issue of the middle class. This is at the center of South Africa, in my view, of South Africa's both positive and negative. The ANC is a party of the middle class, and it is very comfortable with its position in the society. You are saying they are disorganized. Well, why should they be organized? Because they control the public service, they control municipalities, they control state-owned enterprises, and they are paying themselves enormous salaries. So the middle class in this country is doing incredibly well. But what is happening with the 62% who are food insecure that the recent statistics show. So the question of what role is the middle class playing in South Africa, I think it should be a topic for another FNF discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moeletsi. Mbali?
Just to start off with what Moeletsi was saying, so some of the middle class, a particular some that belongs to a political party, is the ones that are really getting the fruits and the benefits. But I do agree that we must have a discussion about what the middle class is doing, because quite frankly, they are the ones that can sustain any kind of revolution. Poor people can protest, they can do a lot, but nowhere in the world are they able to substantially continue it for a long time, because they really have to think about bread and butter issues, and the responsibility must lie on those who have more. If we are genuine citizens and care about citizenship and our fellow human beings and humanity, and I'm appealing to greater angels here, but the evidence is very clear around the world. The people that sustain whatever the economic, political revolution is the people that can do it, which is usually the middle class. Maybe the lower class or the disadvantaged people previously might start it, but that's not where it ends, because then they cannot continue it. And so that is a real, as I was saying, call to us as civil society and people in the middle class in this country to think about what we are willing to do. Then I just wanted to go to some of the questions. In terms of the understanding of registration, yes, you can get people to register and you can force them to do so, but if you can't get them to also then vote, it actually doesn't make much of a difference, and we've again seen this around the world. Australia and a couple of others are the only ones that get people to be able to do that, but if you just force people to register, it doesn't mean that they'll automatically vote, and so that's not really where our problem lies in South Africa. In terms of the GNU and opposition, I agree with the speaker. 76% of our government and parliament is now in the GNU, and that is unhealthy for democracy in all aspects, because the only people that you have in opposition are either completely new entrants who are going to take 5 years, well, you're not new, 5 years to really grasp, and I was at MPL for 10 years, it takes you a long time to really grasp the nuances of the portfolios and the things that you have to understand about how you make things move, and that's too long for where our country is. So I think that we have a real problem in that the GNU is very overly subscribed to having too many parties in it that don't have enough of an opposition voice, quite frankly. And that's not to denigrate what people have tried to do, which I think was a message of hope, but it is something that we as citizens must worry and look out for, because otherwise we're going to find ourselves with people that are going to become captured by the perks. And I think we see it now with people having 4 million rand stints in London as new ministers, who then are not going to be able to say shit, because what are they going to say? You can't say anything about your last members in the last parliament because you're doing the same thing. So it is a real concern for me that that's what is happening. I'll be quick, Ferial. And then I want to say to Bolivia, love your example. And I think that you give a poignant point of where we are in our country. We've done the let's do a super liberal, and I'll say freely, I was in the DA, and though I had to subscribe as a social democrat economically, liberally for sure, socially, that's what I am. But we've tried the let's try and get the free market freely to do what it needs to do. I really think that we need to look at a more social democratic view of our economy, and we have enough here. And things for me like the universal basic income grant are crazy that we're not really talking about them as a real policy that we should be speaking about, where it could literally lift up the forgotten middle, particularly my people in my age group who are not going to work from 18 to 65 and then they earn a pension, but all those productive years of their lives are going to be lost. And that human potential, if we don't give them some kind of way to be able to capture it, which goes back into the economy, is crazy. So I just want to say that I appreciate that, and I hope that our government and Mmusi and people that are in parliament can take this further in their political parties, because I think it's not a conversation that's been happening enough.
Thank you very much. Mmusi, I know you have things you want to answer, but I do have a question for you. So the last time we were here, Ms. Helen Ziller was speaking. And one of the things she said was that no party would ever win a majority again. And I wondered if that's something you agree with and what the new center may look like.
Yeah, certainly think that if nothing changes from an electoral amendment point of view, just on the basis of proportional representation, it is correct to make the assertion that no party will ever get an outright majority. That isn't, though, to say that, as the point that was made earlier, I don't want to punt what we're trying to do, but the submission we are making tomorrow, let alone the constituency-based model, but is the direct election of the president, in which instance, if you swap that around, I think electoral outcomes may certainly reflect a different view. So we have a duty to do now to make sure that we create a different formulation. And that's why we took the matter to the Concord. That's why the matter is now sitting in Parliament. We took the journey. And it's not an eradication of proportional representation, because that sits at the heart of our constitution, but it is about what Van Zyl Slabbert spoke about, which is the 300-100 type split. So I do think what will end up happening is that you may have a new configuration that gets a majority rather than what it was. But at the risk of being overly technical, I do think this is, for me, what sums up this discussion, for me, is what the Kenyans famously say. At first we must be liberated, and then we must liberate ourselves from the liberators.
And that means?
Because I think we still have hegemonic views of liberation. And what happens in that instance, let me speak about the church, an institution I know relatively well. You speak to the South African Council of Churches, you say to them, are you happy with the way the country is being governed? Privately they say no, but publicly they accept that we fought for liberation, this is what we have, we must stick with what we have. They, if you like, are still contributing to the problem. Business in this country, the risk of forming new enemies, because I find them daily. But the lights go off for hours in the day, impacting your very economic prospects. Yet where was the voice of business at the height of load shedding? So the point is, we have a hegemonic view of liberation. We have to undo that so that accountability can be better effected, so that we can achieve a sense upon which politicians fear the citizens rather than the other way around. Because we're becoming tolerant of nonsense. When VIP protection beats up an ordinary citizen, why is that okay in our society? So for me, that is the first starting point. And if we can somewhat come around to that, we can then deploy all institutional capacity to say, but these ones work for us. And that's what we've got to do. I often fear, sometimes when I walk through airports and all of that, the relationship we hold with citizens as public representatives. We're not, in some ways people want to celebrate and they say, you are our leaders. And I sometimes fear about that. And I say that to be honest, because I think the relationship must change. There must come a point where we say to citizens, to public leaders, what are you doing to serve us? Can we come and check on you? Can we come to Parliament to provide oversight? Can we ensure that our voice is heard, whether it be business, whether it be civil society, whether it be young people, it doesn't matter who. Our institutional frame as a country was designed for that transparency. And I think we've got to break that, and we've got to be able to, at the end of the day, ask ourselves better, once we have that relationship, to say, are we okay with having leaders who in many instances suffer from ethical deficiencies? Are we okay with having leaders who in some instances can't even process reading a budget? I don't want to denigrate colleagues, but I have to ask, are we ambitious enough when we end up with public representatives who can't process where we've got to go as a country? Because to my point about the lack of ambition, I don't say that to be glib or populist. I say that honestly to say, sometimes you will hear it a lot. No, the NDP is still our lodestar. The 6-year period between now and 2030 will tell you that there is no chance in this God green earth that we will achieve those. Yet we still talk about it as though it's a goal. What we've got to ask, that's why voters lose credibility, because they look at it and they say, you are promising us what you know very clearly is you are not going to do.
Last word.
But the last word is this. If we get leaders who we can be able to hold accountable and are stronger, a vision that we can begin to back, and then the last thing, which is this, accept that what we agreed to in 94 may not hold in 2030. Therefore, what reviews do we make now to make the transitions that we need to do?
Thank you very much. Inga will now say thank you. Inga Herbert, thank you for this panel.
Wow, this was a real freedom dialogue. Thank you very, very much, Ferial, for having this really lively discussion. Thank you, Mmusi. Thank you, Mbali. Thank you, Moeletsi. This is actually how we planned these freedom dialogues to have. No, we will have time. We will have, sorry, after. So we really designed these freedom dialogues to get into conversation. It's only the 3rd edition, but it's already becoming a brand. And thank you so very much for making it here. I also really want to thank Kwesi, who's actually the mastermind of these freedom dialogues. He was our program director as well. And a word of thanks to the whole team of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. We don't work with an agency here, so these are people who are working the whole day to set this up. We even had a workshop here, so one of the Ugandans we have here in the moment from the NUP party has also raised her voice. So until 3 p.m. we were still sitting here in a workshop, and the team set up after that for this event. So thank you all very much for attending, and we now have time for further bilateral questions and for a cocktail. Thank you very much.